can tell you're more lively today, though.
I am. I'm here. I'm here.
You're ready. So I had this officer on the stand, the state's case agent, and he was answering my questions pretty good. He was a good guy. He was trying to do his best. And I asked him, officer, given everything you've seen in this case, given what you think about the investigation, how would you rate the job that you did on a scale of 1 to 10? Left it wide open for him. What do you think he said?
My thought would be an 11.
Right. Think very highly of himself. Did a great job. He said 7. 7. I was dumbfounded. I expected him to say 10 so that I can say, I had a whole line of questions to say, even with this, even with this, even with this.
I do like that. The to-do and did-not-do list. I like that.
He said 7. I looked at the jury like, did you hear this guy? What he said for himself.
I like that.
Well, why don't we, I got ahead of ourselves. Why don't we introduce the podcast, and then we'll talk about today's topic, Jack.
All right. So this is the Litwack Law Group. I'm Jack Litwack. I'm joined by my partner, Jamar Williams. We're here to talk about, right now, a murder case. I think today's episode is about the narrative of a case and how that works in trial.
The narrative of a case. And using our murder case as an example, this case is a perfect example, in my opinion, of a lot of things that are wrong in our criminal system. Everything from incentivized witnesses to bad science, bad ballistics, to untruthful or dishonest officers. Not that everyone is dishonest or untruthful, but this case involved some of them. Gang allegations, everything. But today we're going to talk about narrative, like you said, Jack. And what do we mean when we're talking about narrative? How would you describe the narrative of a case?
So people are confused about how trials work sometimes. Everybody thinks it's like CSI and everything's on video or audio, but the way trials work is through testimony. It's people coming in and talking. That includes not just witnesses, right, that get up and testify, but also the lawyers advocating on behalf of either the state or the defense. So the state has their theory, which is articulated through a narrative, right? You get up, talk about an opening statement, what you believe the evidence is going to show, or what the state thinks the evidence is going to show, and then they're going to try to repeat that narrative and theory through their witness testimony. On the other end of it, for the defense, the only time we have to rebut the state is when we do our opening statement. So when we talk about our narrative, we'll be talking about things that obviously support a theory that either rebuts the state or our theory of innocence, whatever it may be. But a lot of times when we're talking narrative in the beginning of a case, it's a rebuttal. It's what the state didn't present. It's what we're going to draw out and show you to provide a different perspective than other than just the narrow-minded tunnel vision perspective of the government.
Lots of attorneys, when they think about narrative, they think about theme and theory, right? The theme and theory of your case, that's where you start from. But I think sometimes we're a little short-sighted in that because we can get carried away with just developing one tagline and then attacking the case through a theory the entire time, and we lose the story aspect of a case. I've always taken the position that if I'm in trial, if I'm in battle for my client's life, I want to be able to say that the government didn't do their job and can't meet its burden, but I also want to tell a story that the jurors can hold on to, take back in that deliberation room and say, you know what? I do think this is how this happened. I believe that defense attorney. And I think that's a lot of times what separates us from being able to have a good trial versus not having those aspects of a trial and having a bad trial. I'm glad you mentioned the state's narrative, though, because it's something that I think that we could all identify, especially any public defender, but probably most defense attorneys can identify it. And there's a word, and let's see if you get it. I think you'll know. There's one word that you can guarantee you'll hear in any state's argument, and especially in any state's closing.
Guilty.
That for sure. But this word starts with C.
Firmly convinced. We're talking about consciousness of guilt.
Choices. The most played out thing you could say, it's boring. It's not attention grabbing, in my opinion. I don't know I don't know why all of them use that as the the through line for the way that they tell a story. Have you ever figured that out?
I think it's also, I don't know. They're trying to articulate that our clients could make better choices, right? But it's also to throw out, I think, the idea of the possibility that the jury themselves have choices to make. I think the reoccurring use of the idea of choices plays kind of two roles from a prosecutor's perspective, I think at least. But a lot of it is to shit on our clients and say they could have made better choices, right? Even though obviously they could be completely innocent of the crime. Maybe they made a bad choice about who they were associating with or where they were, things like that.
Yeah, that. And I think a lot of times the state thinks that we're coming from an angle of like, either accident or, not his fault or someone else did it. So we're trying to sort of duck accountability for an action. That's not always what we're trying to do, but I think choices is something easy for them to say to a jury that combats like a multitude of defenses usually. I just don't think it's effective and gripping or very interesting, to be honest. I mean, the idea is a defendant made a choice and there's a consequence, right? Like, okay. What else? You know what I mean?
Like consequences. Yes, that's a constant reoccurring theme.
What else? So for us, I think narrative is important, right? You want to be engaging to a jury. You want to tell a story to a jury. But sometimes I think it actually can be a bad thing. Because there's obviously a whole nother aspect of what we have to do as defense attorneys, explain the state's burden, that we can't lose sight of. Because I think when I tell my client's story in trial, I don't want the jurors going back into the deliberation room and saying, okay, we have story A, we have story B, and if we pick story A or story B, that's the end of it, right? There is a whole nother aspect. It's the state's burden in a case. So I think any good defense attorney, when they're planning to go to trial, they have their narrative, but they also have their way that they attack the state's burden, that they explain the state's burden. Do you have a trick to do that, Jack?
So it's not a trick. It's using the law. The government's always going to use the top part of the instruction, the jury instruction, for beyond a reasonable doubt. If you're firmly convinced, and people, they'll harp on that. And it's kind of confusing for some people, but there's another portion of the instruction that the state always neglects to read where it says, if on the other hand, it's a real possibility that you believe the person did not commit this offense, then you must give them the benefit of the doubt. So when we have our narrative, throwing out different pieces of our narrative, we tell them we don't have to prove anything. I always tell jurors I could sit there with my feet up the whole trial. I'd be rude. The judge would be real upset with me. But I could sit there and do nothing and put my feet up. I could take a nap if I wanted to. But we said all these different things because it's a real possibility of this. There's a real possibility of that. And if they go back there and they're thinking of those real possibilities and they're using the law as the major premise and then the minor premise as the facts of the case, they might come to the correct conclusion, which would be not guilty.
There you go. That's very effective. You got me convinced. Not guilty. I used to, part of when we're describing this, if you just live in the legal terms or live in the legal nomenclature or language, right, or verbiage, I think some of that can get lost on people. When I started out in my career, I used to walk on opposite sides of the courtroom to explain the burden. Some people called it the Jamar walk, but I would start way on one side of the courtroom and I would say, this is how this works. This is where you started when everyone walked in this courtroom, right? And I would say some of the things that you're saying, I would use that to explain the state's burden and walk way over to the other side of the courtroom. Now, obviously, this is ridiculously demonstrative, right?
Dude, I got the same thing. I do the same fucking thing, but it's not the exact. I didn't realize we have the same thing. Mine is I start on one spot and I talk about preponderance of the evidence, a civil standard, 51% to 49%, tip of a scale by a feather's weight. That's a civil case, what you'd have to find if somebody was to be liable for something. Then I go a step ahead and I walk towards the jury and I said, this is clear and convincing evidence. This is what it takes for the government to strip you of your parental rights, to take your kids away. And then I get real close and I say, this is beyond a reasonable doubt. This is the highest burden in our system. And then, depending on the case, I'll walk all the way back and say, we're not here. We're not at clear and convincing. We're not at preponderance. We're all the way back here. That's the same shit.
We do the same thing. I didn't realize that. Did you steal it from me?
Do you use all that stuff? Do you use the three different burdens?
I don't use the burdens.
No?
But no, because I've never been a fan of the burdens. I think the burdens, I don't know. They can be effective. I just don't know that they're necessary.
I think people are confused by the law a lot of times, unfortunately.
But it's good because, we also have the burdens on some of the other demonstratives that we use in closing arguments. So I that's cool. I didn't know that about our closings. Well, it'll be easy for us to write a closing together now that we have some
yeah.
of the same strategies. There's always a character in a case, right? In the investigation, in the allegations, there's always characters, right? Because narratives have elements, and characters are part of those elements. Now, for me, I always have trouble finding a villain in my cases, and I sometimes have trouble finding a hero in my cases, right? The reason I have trouble is because I oftentimes want the government to be the villain, or I want a police officer who made a mistake to be the villain, right? And I want the jurors to blame that person. But that's not always necessary, and I didn't realize that until later in my career. And I also wanted my client to always be the hero, but I don't think that that's necessary a lot of times either. And I think you have to be open on finding those characters when you're developing a narrative of a case. Who do you have a tendency to want to make the villain when you're preparing for a trial?
So that's you talk about early on in your career kind of figuring out what makes sense, wanting to vilify, for example, like a lying police officer. We don't always have that. And frankly, a lot of jurors tend to want to believe police officers despite the fact that we go through voir dire, jury selection, talking about how you can't be biased to one side or another. What I try to do is I look at different factors that play a role before I pick characters. So for example, I just did a trial last week, and one of the issues was human error, right? The person wasn't a villain. I didn't necessarily vilify them. I didn't say that they were wrong. They didn't do anything nefarious. It's not like they purposefully mixed up things, but people make mistakes, right? And I think that helps jurors identify more from a human perspective. Obviously, there are times where you have great villains, right? Great villains. Like if you have an attacker and you continue to call him attacker, 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 or accuser, 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 those are my villains. But it just depends on the case. It depends on the facts and the elements and everything like that.
Absolutely. Every case is different. I'm glad you said people tend to want to believe police. That's something I had to learn as well because sometimes in a trial, everyone is a liar, right? Everyone is lying. And sometimes that happens. It's human nature. But not every case, everyone is lying. And it took me a while to realize that if I can ask the jury to believe everything the state said, to believe every fact in a case, and then ask them still to find my client not guilty, I'm asking them to do a lot less work than if I asked them to disbelieve every witness in a case and to disbelieve every fact in the case. And that, to me, is something I think that you have to perfect because, to me, it's like a Venn diagram, right? If you have the state's facts or the state's elements of a case on one hand, you have our facts, our elements of the case on one hand. If you can make the center of that Venn diagram as big as possible, then it's easier for me to ask you to vote not guilty for my client because I'm not asking you to make too many leaps or too many leaps in logic, right?
Yeah.
What do you think about that? Do you I guess conceptualize the case similarly or no?
I do. And when you talk about defense side in one hand and the state side in the other hand, part of me thinks, okay, because I love presenting stuff even though we have absolutely no obligation to do that, right? So like I like to present some defense witnesses or I like to try to get some stuff in from my client that maybe they said to officers that if it is admissible, I'll try to get that in. The overlap, right, where you meet in the middle to try to get a jury to decide, okay, this is the theory that I'm going to follow, this is the theory that I'm going to believe. But I also like to use the state's evidence and the state's witnesses to get into that middle ground. Right, and to maybe make in my narrative. All right, guys, we'll be back in a second after these short messages.
If you have been accused of aggravated assault in Arizona, you need to call an experienced criminal defense attorney such as myself immediately. The reason for that is aggravated assault has serious penalties. If there's an accusation that there was a car involved or that there was some sort of weapon, even if you've never been in trouble before, you're possibly looking at anywhere from 5 to 15 years in prison if you lose a trial. You need to call an attorney immediately so we can track down witnesses and start investigating the case to formulate a defense as soon as possible. So give us a call if you need any help. We're here to help you.
All right, we were talking about sort of a Venn diagram of facts when you're conceptualizing your narrative of a case and how you want a jury to receive facts, which facts to believe, which facts to reject. And I was asking you if you do something similar.
Yeah, so you know, what I do is, and you talk about that, you said on one hand, I think, you know, you've got the defense facts, on the other hand, you got the state facts. It's confusing because sometimes people think that the defense has to present stuff. We don't have to present anything. When I think about the narrative aspect, I think about stuff that I presented because I try to present as much as I can, even though we don't have to do that. But what I like to do is I like to suck from the state's portion of the case, and basically I'll try to pick maybe a hero in the narrative. It could be an officer who did a good job in their investigation and make that fit in the middle, right? In the middle of that Venn diagram to show how even the state's own witness supports our theory. So that's what I'll try to do in terms of a narrative, picking from their side.
I love that you mentioned the state's investigation, the police investigation, because that to me a lot of times can be a character all in and of itself, right? If it's good, a good investigation, it can be great. I can pump it up during a criminal trial. Mm-hmm. It can still have nothing to do with my client, right? If it's bad, it has everything to do with my client, right? So I love making that investigation maybe play a shining role a lot of times in a trial, because I think it can be very helpful. I also think people want police to do a good job, and when they don't, people get mad about it. And if you can highlight how bad a police officer did or the mistake that they made, and even get them to admit some of the mistakes that they made, I think it's easy to connect that to the state's burden and then ask a jury to do the right thing because of it.
I think it depends on the jury. It depends entirely. You got to get the right jury. You got to get the right jury, because when you're talking about we tend to want them to do a good job. We're bred to do that. Like, we're born thinking they're going to be there to help. Mm-hmm. And it's hard for people to say, okay, well, they did such a bad job, you know, in this investigation, but I kind of like how they sound, you know, and they tried their best. So I'm just going to lean on that side anyway. It's hard. You got to get the right jury.
You're right about that. I love that you brought up a jury, because we could do a whole episode on voir dire, because there was, I won a Batson challenge for this example that we're using. I won a Batson challenge during voir dire, during jury selection. And that person that I won the Batson on ended up being the foreperson for the jury. But we'll talk about that, because this is a very unique juror. And I think he saw through the state's argument a lot of times and saved my client's life.
Nice.
Let's get to the murder, because I want to give you the facts, and we will use the facts of the case as an example on how to build narrative, right? Because this case provides a lot of options on how to build narrative. So we've mentioned the facts before on some of our earlier podcasts, but let's reiterate some of them. Man was found lying in the middle of his house, shot in the head, pool of blood. Excuse us, I should give trigger warnings, huh? Excuse us for the graphic language.
No trigger. People are here for the real shit. Let's go.
When you're a defense attorney, you often talk about graphic stuff. You forget. Furniture not disturbed. Eyewitness says he was shot on his doorstep. This is an incentivized eyewitness. If I remember correctly, 4 or 5 priors that she's getting, felonies that she's getting probation for testifying in this case. Very elaborate description on how he was shot from the incentivized witness on the doorstep. 1 drop of blood on the doorstep, single drop. Front door left wide open. Drug baggie left discarded in the front yard. Pipe, meth pipe, in the bedroom next to a drug bag, a kit that drug users may or may not have. Low denominations of cash near the drug bag in the bedroom. This is not about the scene specifically, but this is also, in my opinion, a very important fact. Nearby, close in time to this murder, a man shot another person with a weapon with the same class characteristics of the weapon they found in this case that we had talked about on a previous episode. And that man was serving time in prison for that murder, probably 1 street down. I'll give you some time to process all of these facts, right? I think these are important facts because you have options to explain what happened that have nothing to do with the defendant in this case, right? 2 or 3. And sometimes when you're trying to develop narrative, I think defense attorneys can get excited about having many descriptions of what happened and have too many. so that you overload a jury and they don't know what to pick from, or they're afraid to not say certain things and narrow down on one, because then you're leaving out very important facts that you don't know what could be relevant for someone, that could be what someone's looking for. So I think you have a lot of options in this case, but it makes it a little bit more difficult, because it's like a burden, right, to figure out where you're going to go and to have a streamlined explanation or story to tell.
A consistent theory and theme throughout each witness that you're cross-examining.
Exactly.
Something that's not all scattered. I hear you.
So given those facts, what stands out to you the most?
I can't ask any questions.
Go ahead and ask.
What's a relationship between the client and the decedent?
Nothing.
Okay.
Well, I shouldn't say nothing. They lived in the same neighborhood and knew of each other.
All right. My narrative off the jump, first of all, my snitch is the bad guy. That's number one. That's one of the bad guys. Not necessarily, obviously the person who actually shot the decedent is the bad guy, because it's not the client. What it looks like is there's drugs in the yard. The snitch claims that the shooting happened. The snitch is likely associated with the drug deal in some ways, or the drug trade. The narrative would be, for me, off the jump, that there was some sort of meeting out front in the yard. Maybe they were getting high. They realized that the decedent maybe was dealing drugs. If there were small denominations of cash, they were looking to get into the house to get some of that money or to get some additional drugs. There could have been conversations in the yard about the drugs. The shooting likely happened inside the house when they were trying to rip off the decedent for either their money or the drugs. The snitch was involved because the snitch claims that the shooting happened on the porch where there's only one drop of blood, right? There's no disturbance inside the place, so it's likely not a burglary, not a robbery, in the sense that they're trying to flip things over. They're trying to lead the person in because they knew the person. They're trying to lead them to the drugs or the cash before something popped off inside the house, where the shooter actually shot the decedent. I think the snitch's elaborate description ties the snitch to the killing, in my opinion. So I think, obviously, it's some sort of drug issue gone wrong. They were either getting high in the front, they went back in for more drugs or more money, or realized that the decedent had those things in there, went in, there was some sort of relationship. Could have been just one, it could have been two people. Maybe the snitch was in there walking next to the decedent and somebody shot the decedent. Where was the decedent shot in his body?
Head.
In the back of the front?
Front.
In the front. Okay. So then they're in the house, and maybe the snitch brings in the second person, and all of a sudden the second person initiates the robbery and shoots the snitch in the head when they, or excuse me, shoots the decedent in the head when they won't tell him where the drugs and the money are, because there's no struggle in there.
Well done, my man.
All right.
Look at you. You're fast on the draw, no pun intended.
Yeah.
That is amazing. So we are aligned. Well, you did something, I should give some more background. You did something that I think is very interesting, and you left something alone that I couldn't leave alone in this trial. And I don't know why I couldn't leave it alone. I probably should have. But number one, you picked the villain as the incentivized witness, or AKA snitch. I did the exact same thing. And I think that's an easy sell in this case, because people don't want to. People can say, hey, the police did the best that they could with the information. It was just bad information, right? People could say, hey, the prosecutor's just doing their job. People could say the judge is doing their job. People could say, we don't really know, maybe one way or another, about the defendant. But when you have a snitch like this, right, and when you have a snitch that's lying like this, an incentivized witness that's lying like this and responsible for something and trots themselves up onto the jury box and tells this lie, I think it's very easy for people to say, that person's doing something wrong and I'm not going to go along with it.
I like it, yeah.
And is that why you picked the snitch?
Well, yeah, and I mean, statistically speaking, snitches are one of the lead reasons for
false convictions.
Yeah, for innocent people being convicted,
Mm-hmm.
you know, especially death row inmates. There's statistical data about that. I think misidentification is number one issue, but snitch is at the top.
So this, the incentivized witness was testifying in part of this trial, right? And she was she didn't like some of the questions I was asking her, and she got kind of offended by some of the questions, right? And she didn't have the best representation in the neighborhood. She actually had a reputation in the neighborhood for setting people up and partying with
All
people.
right,
It's
all
like-
right. Right
it's like
in the-
right there, right? So I'm questioning her about it, right? And she's naming some names, but clearly she feels uncomfortable. And then she stops at one point and she says, "Hey, I'm done answering your questions."
Oh, I love that.
And I said,
That's not how it works, baby.
I'm sorry.
We're in a court of law. I asked a question.
Right? So everyone hopes that happens to them at
Mm-hmm.
some point in their career when they're cross-examining someone, right? Because she teed me up to say, "I'm sorry, man, that's not how this works," right? And I get to tell a jury, I get to demonstrate right in front of the jury that this woman is not a trustworthy person. Another fact that you picked up on that I think was very important in this case is that the dude was found laying in the middle of his house with a gunshot wound to his head. There's no way anyone would believe that someone gets shot in the face, travels all through their house, and then drops down in the middle of their house, not disturbing one piece of furniture. And those are facts that maybe someone would overlook, right? But if you're applying a detailed eye to something, that's teed up for you to explain to a jury. There's no way physically that this person's recounting of what happened could have been the truth of what occurred, right? You did leave out the nearby close in time shooter, though. Why did you do that?
I'd have to develop that more through cross on the snitch, possibly. If you're talking about reputation, opinion, testimony, and how she sets people up, I'd have to figure out how I'm going to get that in. I would use that through the ballistics person. That could have been the person who was with her who she used to set him up, set the decedent up. But it would be somebody who would come in with the ballistics person, somebody that I would likely use the ballistics person for, if you're talking about match comparisons with the gun or with the bullet.
Right. It is hard to get that in, right? But it's obviously a third party defense. But how can you make it relevant? Because if you don't make it relevant, it's a stretch, right? And then you're possibly putting your trust, whatever trust you develop with the jury, you're jeopardizing that if you make too much of a stretch, especially when you got something that's so obvious right in front of you.
Did that come in at the trial?
It did.
How did it come in?
I don't remember. Let me think about that.
How did you even get that shooting happened within that radius?
So this is how it happened. There was, when the shooting happened, it was a whodunit. No one actually knew what actually happened, right? So there was a lot of rumors in the neighborhood floating around here and there. And that was actually the theme of my defense, was that you can't bring a rumor into a courtroom, right? When you have a rumor in a courtroom, you reject it, right? Because this is the place for facts and truth. But there was some, side mention in the murder DR about a dude, was his name, and that man possibly having the same weapon.
They put an investigative lead in one of the reports?
In one of the reports,
that's
right?
good policing, because usually they leave that shit out of there.
Well, they obviously didn't care much about it because they didn't do much with it. It was just some off reference from some other person that they had talked to.
Even after the caliber matched? And the machining matched?
Not the machining, but some of the class characteristics, right? Mm-hmm. And so we went and we found a bunch of other police reports that had this same person in it, and we found a very similar type of murder that happened in the neighborhood. But when I presented this was a case that I did with a co-defendant and a co-defendant's attorney, and at some points we strategized together. When I mentioned this, they said, "We're not going to be able to prove that. We're not going to be able to bring it in. Let's drop it." They eventually changed their opinion on that, and we brought it in. But it was sort of a sidecar narrative rather than the driving narrative of the case. But I'm impressed that you also dropped it too, because you saw sort of maybe the difficulties involved in making that your name.
I need more information.
True. Every good attorney says information. All right. In this case too, you might have a hero. And you can think about the heroes in the case and who might be your hero. Can you think of who might be your hero in this case?
We did a previous episode on the ballistics report, and his opinion was bullshit. But So, I mean, but you could, if there's somebody else who actually matches, right? If there's another gun in the area that committed another murder, similar murder, then maybe you make that person the hero, or the investigator who actually put it in their report, because that's good policing.
Bingo, bango. If you can make a police officer a hero, and that police officer develop the facts that you're relying on for your